Ben Franklin's world is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
We need to imagine people going about their everyday lives and having all sorts of routines that are going to be suddenly upset, including routines around helping people when they're sick. Ordinarily, when somebody's sick, people come, neighbors help out, they help in the fields, they watch through the night. Given the amount of time that one needs to be sequestered, that's quite considerable sort of loss that's faced. And so there's a growth of poverty in this time. And the selectmen and others feel all sorts of concerns that people have. They say they can't pay their taxes, for example. So all of these sorts of things ask for a kind of new imagination to turn on the spur of the moment. There's also a good deal that happens in terms of the just stoppage of daily life and the kinds of things that help people make their way through this world.
The growth of poverty, the disruption and stoppage of everyday lives and routines. This sounds like a scene right from our 2021 lives as we continue to live through the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Only this scene of disruption that historian Ben Muchler has just painted for us is not from 2021, it's from 1721, the year the people of Boston suffered through a devastating smallpox epidemic.
If you see smallpox once, you will probably never forget it. Smallpox begins with a flu-like illness. You think it's just any other flu, but all of a sudden you start getting pustules all over your body. Your palms and the soles of your feet are probably the only place that's spared. You get them inside your mouth, you get them inside your throat. In some cases, you get them all the way down into your lungs, causing pneumonia. You have high fevers.
There are a number of forms of smallpox, including a hemorrhagic form, which was sometimes called blackpox. And in this case, the virus didn't actually form pustules, but would cause bleeding under the skin, which appeared a great deal darker, which lent it its name. And this was a much more severe form that was often fatal. Smallpox primarily spread through contaminated objects or directly person to person. So it's a lot like COVID-19 in that it's transmitted through the air and invades mucous membranes in the mouth, nose, and throat. A number of other strains were actually quite a bit milder, but for those who didn't have immunity or lived with underlying conditions or were subject to harsh labor regimes, including enslaved and indigenous people, smallpox could be devastating.
Smallpox in the 1760s, mid-18th century, starts getting called things like the sovereign disorder, the king of terrors. It's the disease of diseases, the most feared disease of the age. And it had a mortality rate of anywhere between 10 and 25%, even higher for Native Americans. If there was not an epidemic for some time, it could really ravage populations. It's gruesome. There's no asymptomatic smallpox cases.
Smallpox was the most feared disease in North America and in many parts of the world before its eradication in 1980. So how did early Americans live with smallpox and work to prevent it? How did they help eradicate this terrible disease? Over the next 2 episodes, we'll explore smallpox in North America. We'll investigate how smallpox came to North America, how North Americans worked to contain, control, and prevent outbreaks of the disease, and how the story of smallpox is also the story of immunization. It's thanks to the human ingenuity employed to prevent smallpox that we see the development of the world's first immunization procedure, inoculation, and later, the development of the world's second immunization procedure, vaccination. From inoculation to vaccination, we'll discover how early Americans worked to fight the dangerous variola or smallpox virus. Now, to understand how inoculation and later vaccination developed, we first need to understand the history of smallpox, when and where it came from, the threat it posed, and how this disease made its way to North and South America and the Caribbean. This will be part of our focus in this episode, episode 301. Our focus on the history of smallpox is what will allow us to see how the disease and the world's first immunization procedure, inoculation, made their way to North America. It will also allow us to see how early Americans at first challenged and then adopted measures of smallpox control and prevention in the name of public health. So, where does the history of smallpox begin? Where did the disease come from? And how did it impact the people it infected.
The first hints of it appear somewhere in East Asia, China, thereabouts. And we're talking 3,000, 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It definitely is from antiquity. My name is Rene Nájera. I am a doctor of public health. I'm an epidemiologist. I am the director of the History of Vaccines project from the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. It's more than likely associated with an interaction with an animal. Does that sound familiar? It's because we see it all the time happening with Ebola, with coronavirus, with influenza. The exact source of that, obviously, from so many years removed, we don't know. Some scientists have done some genetic analysis to try to look at it. It's very closely related to other pox viruses, monkeypox, cowpox, and that's kind of what leads us to the vaccine eventually. It is definitely something that went from animals to humans.
Smallpox seems to have developed in Asia thousands of years ago, before the Common Era. At some point, the variola virus mutated and went from animals to humans. And in humans, the variola virus could be devastating.
Smallpox is a virus. It was highly contagious, and it would typically manifest in symptoms that included fever, vomiting, a rash that would develop into blisters or pustules that left very notable scarring, and it would often leave its victims blind. My name is Farah Nero, and I am a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. Next year, I will be starting a postdoctoral fellowship at the Alejandro Institute, where I'll be working on my first book, Atlantic Antidote, Race, Gender, and the Birth of the First Vaccine. Smallpox has an incubation period that lasts a little over 13 days. So typically, you wouldn't necessarily notice that you have it to begin with. You could be a carrier for the initial incubation period. People who experienced it described intense pain, right? As people were often incapacitated. Generally speaking, people who wrote about their experiences with smallpox or reflected on them later described being bedridden for the entire time, which would go up to 20 days.
It's got a 30% mortality rate. It's very communicable. It stays in the air and it's transmitted from person to person through aerosol droplets. You also transmit it by living in the same household, right? Like we see now with influenza and coronavirus. It can also be transmitted by what we call fomites, so inanimate objects where the virus will sit. You know, somebody with smallpox scratches a pustule and then they touch something and it stays there and survives. It's a pretty hardy virus, unlike the coronavirus, which we know now that it doesn't live very long in surfaces exposed to things like the sun and the elements. This one did.
As Farah Nero and Rene Nájera describe, smallpox was a disease of intense pain that was capable of causing severe disfiguring scarring, blindness, and brain afflictions like encephalitis. It was a horrible disease that humans, prior to smallpox's eradication in 1980, worked hard to avoid. But how could you avoid contracting a disease that was highly communicable, that awaited its unsuspecting victims on surfaces, and that was hardy enough that the extreme heat of the sun caused it to live in a dry state rather than kill it?
Prior to the introduction of the smallpox vaccine, smallpox could be treated ultimately in two different ways. One was through quarantining. So what doctors would do is they would quarantine known infected patients and use palliative measures. So really the focus was on caregiving, on diet, on ensuring that patients remained hydrated. And the individual treatments often had to do with medical ideas at the time relating to humoral theory. So the prevailing theory, really through up until the 19th century, was that each individual had a unique constitution of 4 different humors, of different bodily fluids. So the idea was that when you were sick, that something was off with your constitution. And so doctors would apply particular medicines and foods to try to rebalance those humors. So that was one method. Another was through inoculation.
You know, this is a virus that can survive drying. What places like China and like the Ottoman Empire had been doing was called variolation or inoculation, in which they would take a weakened form of the virus from people's scabs and drying them out and just hoping that they got the right strain that wasn't too bad. And they would give it to a person either by cutting into their skin and then putting the scab in there, or by grinding it up and having the person aspirate it. and that would cause a very low level infection. A physician would usually look over you to make sure that, you didn't get too sick. You would get some medicine to try to deal with the side effects. And it had less of a mortality rate than getting it the natural way. And if you lived through it, then you had immunity for the rest of your life.
Smallpox inoculation, or variolation, was the world's first immunization procedure. This procedure called for someone to look for a mild case of smallpox, and then to either dry out the pus from a smallpox pustule, as they did in China or parts of the Ottoman Empire, or by taking the pus from a mild case of smallpox and transferring that pus directly under the skin of a person who wanted to avoid contracting smallpox the natural way, which would have been through the air or through picking up the virus from a fomite on an inanimate object. The goal and hope of variolation or inoculation was that by infecting yourself with a minor case of smallpox, you could come through the throes of the disease as easily as possible and emerge with a lifetime immunity to the variola virus. This is really an ingenious medical observation if you think about it. The fact that humans observed that they could take a minor case of the disease of diseases, which not only lowered the mortality rate of smallpox, but added the benefit of lifetime immunity from the variola virus. It makes you wonder, when and how humans made this observation and developed the inoculation procedure.
The theory goes that somebody noticed that a body dried out in the desert somewhere in the Gobi Desert in Asia, somebody who had smallpox, somebody aspirated the dust, and then they became feverish. They had a little bit of the disease, but not too much. And then they noticed that they were immune to the next wave of the epidemic. And so they put two and two together and said, okay, there's something about breathing in the dust from somebody who died from this that protects me. This is before germ theory. They don't know what a virus is. They don't know what a bacteria is. They don't even know what a cell is. There's no microscopes. There's nothing like that. So it's just observational. And then they started grinding up the scabs from people who had smallpox. They would take their scabs and let them dry out in the sun and then grind them up and give it to people as a dust, to blow it in their face, basically, to have them inhale it. And so then they noticed that people who did that, they would not get as sick, and then they were immune.
In the Middle East and parts of West Africa, it was more common to practice incisions. The idea is that you would cut an incision into the arm or the hand of a healthy patient, insert the live smallpox matter, and then wait for the 20 days to pass. And these patients would be put in quarantine, ideally, so that they would not infect anybody else. In parts of West Africa, it was sometimes practiced as a form for young men before they would potentially go off to war, where they might be exposed to smallpox. And famously, inoculation was practiced in the Middle East using this form of incision by women in what would become Turkey. And this is the story of how smallpox inoculation makes its way into England.
There were two different forms of the inoculation procedure: inhaling the dried scabs from a mild case of smallpox, and transferring the pus from the pustules of a mild case into the incision of a healthy person. Inoculation by inhalation prevailed in parts of Asia, while the incision method prevailed in parts of Africa and the Ottoman Empire. As Ferraniero mentioned, the incision method of inoculation is the process of variolation that made its way to England during the 18th century. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the English ambassador to Turkey, saw a Turkish woman performing the inoculation procedure and decided to have her own child inoculated. Montagu then wrote about the procedure, and her description made its way back to the Royal Society of London, England's foremost institution for scientific knowledge. The Royal Society's publication about inoculation is partly how colonists in British North America learned about the procedure. However, the adoption of inoculation in the Americas is a bit more complicated than the flow of information from Turkey to Europe, and that's because the Americas' history with smallpox was more limited and diverse.
Smallpox doesn't actually make its way into Europe until the 6th century and into the New World until the 15th century. Essentially, when indigenous people came over the Bering Strait, which I believe was in 10,000 BCE, that would have been a moment potentially when the virus could have come over. It doesn't seem to have done so. Smallpox really, it makes its way over as soon as Columbus really is operating in the Caribbean. The first documented case, though, that we have comes from the island of Hispaniola. It's recorded by Hieronymite friars who are there. This is the island that will become the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Smallpox was really only one of many diseases that the Spanish brought over. They also brought over measles and typhus. And so a number of these diseases contributed to the devastating mortality rates for indigenous peoples during this period of time. The idea of a virgin soil epidemic, that indigenous people didn't necessarily have immunity, and that is part of the reason why they suffered from smallpox so much more than the Spanish. But one of the things that's really important to bear in mind is the effects of famine and the effects of living conditions at this moment, because not only do you have the Spanish who are coming in, who are already starting to demand tribute, are absorbing resources, and are in the first few centuries are also starting to begin urbanization of indigenous communities, of trying to gather them for the purposes of tribute extraction. And so all of those things were factors in the spread of smallpox.
The first Spanish explorers to the Americas brought smallpox and other diseases with them. Diseases that the indigenous populations of North and South America had never endured, because these diseases failed to cross over the Bering Strait from Asia around 10,000 BCE. Without exposure to smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases, the indigenous populations of the Americas and the Caribbean evolved without building any semblance of immunity to them. This, along with the factors of famine, coerced labor, and urbanization, all of which weakened immune systems and made it easy for diseases to spread through human-to-human contact, meant that the indigenous populations of the Americas were often devastated when these Old World diseases struck. Within a generation of settlement, European colonists also found themselves very exposed and susceptible to epidemics of smallpox. During the colonial period, parts of French, Dutch, and British North America never came close to equaling the population centers of Europe in terms of their density. Which means, while smallpox was considered a childhood disease in Europe because it was ever present in Europe's urban centers, it was considered an everyone disease in North America. North America just didn't have enough urban population to ensure the continued presence of smallpox. Which means, the variola virus would enter a port, wreak havoc as an epidemic, and then die out for the next 15 to 20 years, while a fresh group of non-immune Americans grew up and presented smallpox with a new host of people it could infect. The result of these periodic epidemics in colonial urban centers proved so devastating that British Americans like Cotton Mather of Boston started looking for ways to mitigate the impact of epidemics.
Cotton Mather is a very prominent minister in late 17th century, early 18th century New England. I'm Ben Muchler. I teach at Oregon State University. I focus on colonial and revolutionary early national America, and then I have research interests in the history of disease and poverty and disability.
Ben is also the author of the book, The Province of Affliction, Illness and the Making of New England, which, in addition to exploring the surprising roles that illness played in shaping the foundations of New England society, also investigates the Boston smallpox inoculation controversy of 1721.
Even though New England is one of the healthiest areas in the Western Hemisphere, it's still riddled with disease of all sorts. Lots of epidemics that are sweeping through, chronic disease. And so it was very much part of everyday life. And the suffering occasioned by it was something that Mather was quite familiar with. He himself had had smallpox in the late 17th century, and a relatively light case of it. But his children get this, 3 of them, and they survive in 1702, this major outbreak that happens in Boston. But Mather loses many of his children to various diseases. 3 of his children and his wife died in a measles epidemic in 1713.
Cotton Mather's experience with epidemics, which included his professional work as a minister, helping his parishioners get through each public health crisis, and his personal life, as epidemics impacted and ravaged his own family, prompted him to look for ways to help Boston and its people lessen their fear and susceptibility to epidemics like smallpox.
There's really sort of 2 strands to this. The first is that there is a learned discourse that comes from England, part of the Royal Society, a sort of chief scientific society of the time, And in its published transactions, the philosophical transactions, there's interest in writing about inoculation. And that interest starts early in the 18th century, and then there are two pieces published in 1714 and 1716. So one way you could learn about this would be to read about it. The other way is through actually African knowledge, which is present in the colonies through Africans that have been enslaved and brought to New England. And that knowledge is there, in effect, sort of in hiding from historians until crises erupt, and then we hear a bit more about it, as we do in the 1720s. So through enslaved Africans, there's also a kind of folk knowledge about this, as it would have been conceived of at the time in popular discourse, and ideas about inoculation being something that was common and efficacious, that it protected people.
Inoculation was practiced by enslaved Africans who were coming over to the Caribbean, which wasn't always documented, right? So there's really interesting cases that suggest inoculation was happening probably more informally than we know in sites that weren't documented. So there are multiple channels through which knowledge about inoculation made its way across the Atlantic world.
And Mather learns about inoculation in these two different ways. First of all, he's a corresponding member of the Royal Society, and he reads these pieces that come out in 1714, 1716, and is convinced by them. They are compelling narratives, and he recognizes the possibilities that inoculation may have for people in Boston. In 1721, when we finally have this outbreak, it's been many years, nearly 2 decades since the last major outbreak in Boston. And so he's probably looking around, anticipating that. But he also, prior to reading these pieces, hears about inoculation from an enslaved African whom he names Onesimus. This person is gifted to him by his church. Onesimus comes to Mather in 1706, and they appear to have had a conversation within the next year or so about this. And he queries Onesimus and asks him about whether Onesimus has ever had smallpox. And Onesimus replies, well, yes and no, meaning that he has been inoculated. And he shows Mather a scar on his arm to represent that inoculation, and says that while he has taken on this operation, he never subsequently suffers from smallpox.
Cotton Mather was a famous and well-respected minister in Boston. Mather was the kind of person that Bostonians turned to when they needed spiritual guidance, knowledge, or help during times of crisis. And before the Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721 began, Mather had learned about inoculation and its potential life-saving ability by both reading about it in the Royal Society of London's journals and through the practical experience of his enslaved man, Onesimus.
When smallpox arrives in 1721, Mather starts saying, we should do this. We should inoculate people based on this method that Onesimus has told me about, that we've heard about from Turkey and other places. I'm Andrew Werman. I'm an associate professor of history at Central Michigan University, and I research smallpox and inoculation in early America. I'm writing a book that's coming out next year with Johns Hopkins University Press called The Contagion of Liberty, The Politics of Smallpox in the Revolutionary Era.
Although Cotton Mather advocated for the inoculation procedure as both a way to mitigate the outbreak of smallpox in 1721 and to protect Bostonians against future outbreaks of smallpox, most people questioned rather than heeded Mather's advice. How, Bostonians wondered, could a procedure learned from enslaved Africans and practitioners in the Ottoman Empire and promoted by a minister rather than a medical doctor be safe for Bostonians to pursue?
In 1721 was the first time that you've got someone in the colonies, in the British world, advocating for the broad use of inoculation. And it was controversial. It was controversial on racial grounds. This was something that had been known about in some scientific circles, but it was coming from China. There were reports from Turkey. It didn't seem like something that Christians had invented or that Christians ought to do. When smallpox arrives in 1721, this is only about 30 years after the Salem witch trials, Ministers in Massachusetts, very religious place, start saying, well, that's playing God. God decides who becomes afflicted, who survives disease. If you purposefully give someone a disease, that's God's work. And Mather pretty easily combated this by saying, God has told us about inoculation, so it would be an affront to God not to use a gift that he's given us. And then that gift becomes a problem. Other scientists, a man named William Douglas, points out a number of flaws with Mather. First of all, Mather is not a scientist, he's not a doctor, he's a minister.
There's a long tradition in New England of the preacher-physician. And this is the idea that one is a minister, but they apply themselves not only to the soul, but the body of their flock. And it was common in the 17th century to have these sorts of figures who might even prescribe medicines. That sort of tradition is waning somewhat by the early 18th century, but Mather reads in different medical treatises, pays attention to all things medical, sometimes prescribes for family and friends. And there is no real contradiction between being a minister and being interested in medicine. The next time that smallpox rears its head, Mather decides that he's going to encourage people to pursue inoculation. Mather winds up encouraging the doctors in town to consider inoculation. He writes to physicians who, pretty much to a person, reject him. And one of the ideas here is that he's overstepping his authority as a minister. This is properly the province of physicians in town.
It's a debate over who controls access to medical knowledge. William Douglas was a university-trained physician, and he says, hold on, we need more testing. We can't just open this up to the public. We need to make sure it's safe first. And Douglas went further, and he said, how could a scientific discovery be found by a slave, by an African? It doesn't make sense. Maybe the Africans are trying to cheat us. Maybe they're getting back to us for slavery. Maybe it's a big joke for them. It'll cause an epidemic. Mather tries to say, well, God often works among the lowly. It's not surprising that God would bestow a gift upon lowly people in low circumstances, and we have to be receptive to this.
Bostonians feared smallpox inoculation for a number of reasons. First, not only was it a new procedure, but it is where the knowledge of this new procedure came from. Intellectual elites like Cotton Mather, Dr. William Douglas, and other physicians and ministers argued about who should offer and prescribe medical advice. As Ben Muchler noted, through the 17th century, medical doctors in colonial British America had been few and far between. So religious men and women steeped in medical knowledge of plants and childbirth often prescribed medicine and dispensed medical advice. But by the 18th century, this had begun to change as the number of medical doctors in the British colonies grew. Of course, in 1721 Boston, there was only one university-trained medical physician, and that was Dr. William Douglas, who, as Andrew Wehrman pointed out, wanted his formal medical education and authority as a professional practitioner of medicine to be recognized. For Douglas and other colony-trained doctors, they wanted medical knowledge to come from other doctors, not from ministers, women, and especially not from non-white and enslaved people. Now, the second reason Bostonians feared inoculation was religion. New England was a deeply religious place in the early 18th century, and the idea that a minister or doctor might play God and give someone a live, if mild case of smallpox to prevent their taking the disease in a worse way naturally seemed to go against Bostonians' religious beliefs as Puritans and as Christians, especially when the knowledge for this procedure came from non-Christians in China, Turkey, and Africa. Race was central to Boston's inoculation debate and controversy. And the third reason Bostonians feared inoculation was that the procedure involved infecting healthy people with smallpox. Inoculators would look for a person with a mild case, take pus from their pustules, and then insert that pus under the skin of non-infected people. As Onesimus described to Mather, this procedure would allow the inoculated person to come through a mild case of smallpox, which they would then hopefully survive and emerge with a lifetime immunity to the variola virus. Still, many Bostonians wondered why it would make sense to fight a burgeoning smallpox epidemic by purposely infecting healthy people with smallpox. They didn't quite trust or understand how the procedure worked because no one in the colonies had yet to observe inoculation in practice. As Dr. Renee Nehera told us earlier, early Americans didn't know anything about germ theory. Plus, there was a financial cost to this procedure that many working class and poor Bostonians could not afford, which made them feel even more susceptible to smallpox, that king of terrors, that disease of diseases.
Mather finally is able to get one physician to agree to inoculate. That's Zabdiel Boylston. He's somebody that's not trained in terms of sort of formal medical education that you might get in Europe, but he is somebody that has a lot of practical experience, and he is also on the edge in a certain way of new developments in medicine in New England in this period. He's a successful stone cutter, meaning that he operates on the gallstone, and he's also performed a mastectomy. Zabdiel Boylston takes this up, and Boylston inoculates his 6-year-old son and 2 enslaved workers that he has, Jack, who's in his 30s, and then Jack's son, Jackie, who is 2.5, and he waits and sees what will happen. And then he continues on and works his way steadily, keeping notes that he later publishes person by person, inoculating people that are asking for this. These are many elite people who are themselves being inoculated. Also, people are inoculating their children and their servants and slaves. And so this continues on. At the same time, Douglas objects to Mather and to Boylston and what he's doing. And initially, the public is really listening much more to Douglas in this. The selectmen call in physicians to talk about what they've heard about inoculation, and they tell terrible stories about this, that it can lead to death.
As Bostonians followed the inoculation debate between Mather, Boylston, and Douglas in Boston newspapers, smallpox raged throughout the town, prompting Boston officials to take other precautionary measures to try and stop the spread of the variola virus. How did the famous Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721 begin? And what precautions did Bostonians take to try and manage the virus and its spread? We'll investigate answers to these questions just after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. Enjoying the narrative style of From Inoculation to Vaccination? If so, you should join the Omohundro Institute and Mass Humanities for another 2-episode narrative series on Ben Franklin's world. It's called The World of the Wampanoag. On December 16, 1620, the ship Mayflower sailed into Plymouth Harbor and dropped anchor. Standing aboard this 236-ton ship stood 102 passengers and roughly 30 crewmen. Those settlers have been called Pilgrims, and 2020 marked the 400th anniversary of their arrival in New England. What happened when the Mayflower's passengers disembarked and came ashore? What kind of world did they find themselves in? In episodes 290 and 291, we explore the Pilgrims' new world, which was, and still is, the very old world of the Wampanoag people. For more than 12,000 years, the world of the Wampanoag has been a world filled with life, culture, and trade. It is a world filled with many indigenous peoples, and it was this indigenous world that the English colonists settled in and adapted to. So who were and are the Wampanoag, who lived and live around present-day Plymouth? Who are some of their closest neighbors, the Narragansett, who live to the south? And how did the Pilgrims adapt to living in a decidedly indigenous world? Join the Omohundro Institute and Mass Humanities for a special 2-episode series about the world of the Wampanoag before and after 1620. The Wampanoag's history has always been spoken. Hear it on Ben Franklin's World in episodes 290 and 291. How did the famous Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721 begin? And what precautions did Bostonians take to manage the virus and its spread? Ben Muchler has the story for us.
On May 8th, the selectmen of Boston who are managing the epidemic, they note in their words that there's a Negro man in town that's suffering from the smallpox. And it seems to be that he's associated with the ship, the Seahorse. He had stayed in Boston. And what we find out also is that in the intervening weeks, maybe some 24 other people from the ship are wandering the streets of Boston. By May 8th, there's a report of smallpox. For the person that's stricken, they're to be maintained in a house, and nurses are impressed who are made to serve them and care for them, and guards are appointed outside the house so that nobody can enter or leave without permission. And the ship itself, the Seahorse, an inspector goes out to check on this, and that inspector finds that indeed there is smallpox there. And we can watch the epidemic unfold.
Smallpox is spreading throughout the population of Boston. 5,000 people in a city of 10,000 catch the disease naturally.
The town meeting gets concerned, and it asks its representatives to the general court to help empower the selectmen, to give them a special coercive powers during an epidemic of smallpox. Free blacks in Boston are ordered to clean the streets, and this is part of public health measures, sanitation measures. There's a broad idea that various sorts of dirt and debris, rotting materials, lead to poisonous exhalations, and if you're around them, you might catch disease. So cleaning them up is terribly important. That free blacks are chosen to do this reflects this is dangerous to do in a time of smallpox. The cases start to grow, so many cases that it's impossible to maintain guards outside of everybody's house, and things take off from there. People begin to flee the city. Maybe some 900 leave. That's a remarkable number, given there's just around 11,000 in the town itself. In October, it's the month where the largest numbers of folks die. Some 411 people in town die that month. And in the end, 5,758 people contract the pox the natural way, that is, not through inoculation. 842 of them die, and that's around a 14 to 15% case fatality rate. And that's in line with smallpox, which can kill between 10 to 30% of the people it infects, and even higher rates for the very young and the very old. So this is a quite significant outbreak that becomes a full-on epidemic that shuts down Boston.
The 1721 smallpox epidemic began because Boston was connected to the world through trade. The ship Seahorse transported goods between Boston and the West Indies. Sometimes, this trade brought disease. The Boston selectmen took as many precautions as possible to curb the spread of smallpox. They quarantined infected people in their homes or in pest houses. They impressed and hired people to nurse the sick, and posted guards or red flags outside the homes to warn people of the danger inside. They also ordered mandatory street and house cleanings to ensure infectious materials were cleared. In many ways, the precautions Bostonians took in 1721 are not unlike the precautions taken in 2021 to curb the coronavirus. Although 3 centuries distant from each other, in both situations, the government asked people to give up some portion of their civil liberties in the name of public health. How did Bostonians feel about this sacrifice in 1721?
It's a sharply hierarchical world with rights and privileges determined based on one's place in that hierarchy. What happens in New England is there's a collectivist sense to this, not egalitarian, but a sense that the individual's needs need to be subordinated to the needs of the group as a whole. In the case of illness, the notion is that they belong to a community. If you're suffering, that we need to help each other out. I might need to relinquish my luxuries and my individual sorts of desires so that the necessities of everybody can be met. And I think that that marks New England as somewhat distinctive, especially in what it can demand of that group as a whole. It's a remarkable set of strictures within the public health world that people are being asked to adhere to. And while there's all sorts of infractions, they do wind up, on the whole, adhering to them.
While some people avoided the restrictions placed on their lives, by and large, the people of Boston pulled together and adhered to tough strictures that limited their movement, gathering, and daily routines, all in an effort to curb the spread of smallpox. And their personal sacrifices met with a lot of success. Here's Andrew Wehrman.
The 1721 epidemic pretty much just affected Boston and some surrounding communities, Roxbury and Salem. The thing was, once it got out that there was smallpox in one place, any trading partner of that community would shut off trade. So New York would say, we're going to closely inspect ships coming out of Boston. And there wasn't as much commerce between cities in the 1720s, so it stayed pretty isolated in Boston.
And what role did Cotton Mather and Zebdale Boylston's work to introduce and practice inoculation have on the epidemic? Just how effective was inoculation in keeping Bostonians from dying from smallpox in 1721?
The statistics that are gathered, which are remarkable. Zebdale Boylston keeps careful track of who's being inoculated, and James Franklin is charged with keeping track of infections and deaths. So we've got a lot of data on this, and people can review it afterwards. You know, it's 287 people in total that Boylston is able to inoculate. So it's, between 1% and 2% of the population, perhaps, that's finally inoculated. And it looks like, on the whole, that inoculation actually doesn't lead to widespread death among the inoculated. Maybe 2% of people, 6 out of the people that have been inoculated, die.
It's interesting how reports of Boston's epidemic bounce around. They smooth over a lot of those debates, and it boils down to the numbers of what happened. People are fascinated by inoculation, how successful it was. And so people in other cities are paying attention to it. They're publishing short notices of what happened in Boston, the numbers who are inoculating in their newspapers. Benjamin Franklin is probably the key figure. Ben Franklin was a teenager in 1721 in Boston. When Franklin moves to Philadelphia and begins publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette and Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin publishes the statistics on Boston. He'd write about the success that happens. He advocates for inoculation.
Much of the data that circulated about smallpox inoculation in 1721 Boston came from the pen of Zebdale Boylston. As Ben Muchler informed us earlier, Boylston kept detailed notes of who he inoculated and how they took and came through smallpox. Or, if they didn't come through smallpox, how they died. Boylston's notes did a lot to help inform the British Atlantic world of the efficacy of inoculation, as did Boylston's lectures, which he began giving after 1722. But in addition to providing important and needed data about inoculation, Boylston's work also began erasing the racial politics that had consumed Bostonians' thoughts and attitudes towards the inoculation procedure in 1721.
Boylston travels to London in 1724, becomes a fellow in the Royal Society. They publish his report on what happened. Boylston doesn't talk about Onesimus at all. He doesn't talk about it being African knowledge. He touts himself. And William Douglas, when he starts writing about it, erases Onesimus from the story, and they start deciding that this is an American discovery, something that they've put together for themselves. So over time, when people start writing about the history of inoculation in the 18th century, they smooth over some of those parts that might not sound as appealing to them. They hide that inoculation may have come from India or China or certainly Africa.
While Boylston's data and writings about the 1721 smallpox epidemic assuage fears about adopting a foreign, non-white, and non-Christian practice by leaving out the true source of his knowledge about inoculation, what Boylston's writing and data could not do was alter the fact that inoculation was a procedure that only wealthy and some upper-middling colonists had access to. Inequities to access in healthcare is something that Dr. Renee Nahera encounters a lot as an epidemiologist and as a public health professional.
From the very beginning, we in public health get trained to look at the social inequities, because that is what drives a lot of these diseases, a lot of these epidemics are the inequities more than the viruses and bacteria themselves. So if you're of a lower social class, even to today, you're more likely to live in congregate settings or in overcrowded settings, which leads to huge disease transmission. And the lack of access to healthcare, to inoculation, to somebody who knows how to do inoculation, the lack of access to healthcare is present. So the lower socioeconomic level you are, then the less likely you are to have access to these things. And it repeats over and over again as the first vaccines come around.
Inoculation did a lot to help colonists create some immunity to smallpox. But it was still a procedure that not everyone had access to or could afford. Plus, inoculation was dangerous. To inoculate someone meant to purposely infect a healthy person with smallpox, all in the hope that they might take a mild case of the disease and come through the illness with a lifetime immunity to the variola virus. Even without an understanding of germ theory or modern medicine, there were some in the British Atlantic world who wondered if there wasn't a better way to keep people safe from smallpox. This wondering eventually led to the discovery and development of the world's second immunization procedure, vaccination. How did vaccination come about? What were vaccination's connections to inoculation? And how did news and practice of vaccination spread throughout North America? These are questions we'll investigate and answer in our next episode, From Inoculation to Vaccination, Part 2. This episode is part of a 2-episode series about the history of inoculation and vaccination, which is co-written and co-produced by Liz Covart and Holly White. You'll find more information about our guests, Renee Najera, Farron Yero, Ben Mutchler, and Andrew Wehrman, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/301. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends. Word-of-mouth recommendations are the best way for podcasts to find new listeners. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, Karen Wolf, and Peyton Young. Finally, please join us again on May 11th for episode 302, which is the next episode in our series, From Inoculation to Vaccination. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.